Do we have too much government?
We need to put people ahead of corporate profits.
This system is so lopsided.
This threat is a real threat to democracy.
And I think that's really important. That's something we haven't been doing in this country for a long time.
Where do you start? What do you do? How do you do it?
Access to Democracy and other Eagan community television programming is supported by Thomson Reuters, makers of Westlawn Next and based in Eagan. Through Westlawn Next and other innovative online services, Thomson Reuters is the world's leading source of intelligent information for businesses and professionals. Online at thomsonreuters.com. And by U.S. Federal Credit Union, the member-owned financial institution offering service, value, and experience you can trust to the greater Twin Cities community.
Welcome to this edition of Access to Democracy. I'm your host today, Steve Francisco. It's a real pleasure to invite to our studio today a new guest. Audrey Britton is the Public Relations Director for
Small Business Minnesota,
and also has a history working in communications. You've worked at Allianz and Honeywell and a number of other places, and you also started your own firm called Britton Communications.
That's right.
Tell us a little bit about why you started your own business.
Boy, that's a long story. I'll try to make short. I started my career in communications. I've always been in communications. So started at a government agency. I was there for about 7 years and decided I needed some corporate experience. So I did that for about 7 years, and the first place I went got acquired. So I was hired by another corporation, and they got acquired. And as as acquisitions go, sometimes CEOs bring in their new team and the old team goes away, and I thought, well, enough of this, I'm just going to start my own business, and I've been doing that for about 7 years.
And you also, in your past, I see that you had done some work closer to our neck of the woods here. You were Public Relations Director for the Minnesota Valley Transit Authority.
I was, and I will say that was probably my favorite job.
Mm-hmm. So tell us about Small Business Minnesota, your current endeavor, and what are you doing there, and what is Small Business Minnesota? What do you do?
So Small Business Minnesota is a nonprofit, nonpartisan, statewide organization of small business owners. So all of our members are business owners right here in Minnesota. They have fewer than 100 employees. And we started this venture because we were finding a couple things. There wasn't really a community and a voice just for small businesses. There were plenty of people saying we speak for small businesses, but no business owners coming to the table to say this is really the experience of being a small business owner in Minnesota. So we offer public advocacy, we do educational forums, networking, and then if you follow us on Facebook and sign up for our newsletter, you'll get the latest and greatest small business news.
Mm-hmm. So Minnesota is in the early days of MNsure, which is Minnesota's version of the Health Insurance Exchange. Mm-hmm. And Small Business Minnesota is actually a grantee to do outreach work. Tell us a little bit about that. What is your role in the rollout and implementation of MNsure here in Minnesota?
So let me clarify a couple things. MNsure has navigators, and those are people who actually, you can call them up, they'll stay on the phone with you, they'll help you go through the process, maybe even help you identify which plan you want to sign up for and why. And then there's outreach partners, that's what we are. Mm-hmm. And our role in this, what we signed up to do, is to specifically reach out to the small business community and bring in experts to talk with them. Of course, through our newsletters and Facebook and whatnot, we provide information. So we're really trying to make sure, as we do in other endeavors with Small Business Minnesota, that small business owners get just the facts so they can base their decisions on those facts.
Mm-hmm. Because a lot of small business employers, and frankly, the number of small businesses far outnumbers larger businesses. Small businesses are, in fact, the biggest employers in Minnesota.
Yes,
is that correct? So many of them have been offering health insurance plans to their workers, and with the implementation of the Affordable Care Act, there are some changes underway. How is the MNsure exchange helping small businesses in Minnesota right now?
So I want to let you know something. Actually, a lot of small business owners, a lot of small businesses don't offer health care or health coverage, health insurance. And this is exactly why, part of the reason the Affordable Care Act was implemented. Small businesses tend to spend about 18% more on health insurance than the large businesses per employee. Also, when you're a small business, you don't have the negotiating power. You can't self-insure. So health insurance, as we survey our membership, and national surveys as well, show that health insurance is the #1 concern of small business owners. And that's above regulations, above taxes, you name it. Health insurance is their top concern. So of course they want to have a healthy workforce. They want to be able to attract and retain top talent, which, you know, benefits does that. And they also want health insurance for themselves and their family.
So Audrey, we've seen a lot of anger and frankly verging on hysteria about the new Affordable Care Act being implemented. Why do you think there has been so much anger and opposition to the Affordable Care Act and the attempt to insure millions and millions of Americans who have no health insurance? Why are we seeing all this anger?
So you know what I would do? I would step back in history just a couple years ago, 2-3 years ago, or maybe a little longer than that, when Minnesotans sometimes have a concern that we pay into the federal government but we don't get federal dollars back. So the federal government said, you know, people not having health insurance is really a problem. So we're going to expand Medicaid, give you some of your money back, and then more people will have health insurance coverage. And as you and I both know, people not having coverage leads to a myriad of social problems, which we can talk about in a minute.
If I could just interject, we expanded early Medicaid to people up to 138% of the federal poverty level. I think that's the figure I had seen.
Okay. I don't know the exact numbers.
So it's a significant opportunity to add people who don't have health insurance.
Exactly. And then why wouldn't you do that? And we didn't, right? When Governor Pawlenty was in office, he decided not to take up that offer, and I think a lot of us were pretty perplexed by that. You can't complain that you don't get federal dollars back in, and then when they're offered to you, reject it.
But the opposition to Affordable Care Act seems to go far beyond just early Medicaid expansion.
Right, and I would
do you think there are philosophical reasons, or is it just all politics? What's your read on this?
My read, and of course it's just my opinion, is exactly that. So if we can't even expand Medicaid when it's handed to us for no cost, I think the people that have been rejecting those type of ideas for whatever reason are therefore rejecting MNsure as well. And maybe we should clarify, Steve, MNsure is what Minnesota set up independently of the federal system to meet the requirements of the Affordable Care Act.
Right. Well, the Affordable Care Act actually told the states you can set up your own health insurance exchanges, actually encourage them. Minnesota's received, I think, about $150 million to help set up MNsure. But a number of states decided that they didn't want to go that direction, particularly states in the South and the West, red states, if you will, with Republican governors and legislators. And it's interesting that it's in those states where you're hearing about really a lot of problems with the online website, because they're relying on the federal site, which, as we know, and we're going to talk about that, they've had some problems. But the states that did what Minnesota and Massachusetts and California did and New York are having fewer problems.
Exactly.
And actually, aren't they enrolling people?
Yes, they
so
are.
It's not all this complete debacle of nobody's able to find insurance or get enrolled.
Right. Exactly. So if we could say one thing, it's, you know, MNsure isn't perfect yet. I've never seen an IT rollout that has been perfect, ever, and I've worked with chief technology and chief information officers in my career. But it's doing much better than what you're seeing for those states that are trying to sign up through the federal level. So if I had my wish, I wish we could separate the two stories a little bit, because myself, I'm, you know, a sampling of one, but I went on to sign up my business, and I think I was on the MNsure site for maybe 10 minutes, put in all my information, I have an account.
And aren't we in fact seeing that a number of small businesses in Minnesota are reporting that they're finding some benefits of using MNsure, using the state exchange. What are some of the benefits that they're seeing? Lower premiums?
You know, a little bit of everything, right? One of the maybe major benefits for small, well, it is a major benefit for small businesses, is if you have a workforce, and 5 employees tends to be kind of a magic number in Minnesota. A lot of businesses,
With just 5 people.
have 5 employees. So if you have 1 employee have some catastrophic illness or an accident, the health insurance for that group, and it's a 5-person group, so they're spreading the risk across only 5 people. Some of them have just said we can no longer afford health insurance. So now, with the pre-existing conditions being gone, they're finding they're able to afford health insurance again.
And are they also seeing that they have more policies to choose from than when they were going it alone, basically, and looking for insurance for their employees?
So there is, this is a little bit complicated to explain. In health insurance, you actually don't want 1,000 choices. I mean, and that's what we used to have. And sometimes it can be a little bit of a marketing gimmick that if you give consumers so much choice, they just give up and they say, give me anything. You know, imagine going to the store and you want to pick up a can of beans and there's 100 brands there. You're not going to sit and read every can. You're eventually just going to grab one and walk away. So right now I believe there are about 140 plans to pick from, which is plenty of choice. The good thing that MNsure is doing is it's giving you apples to apples. So there's not very many small businesses, if any at all, who can sit down and read through a 50-page contract saying what's covered and what's not. Comparing the cost, you actually end up with literally millions of choices when you start cross-segmenting this. So with an apples to apples comparison, you can say, okay, these plans I know are all the same. They're going to cover this. I don't have to read every single policy to figure out what I want. So,
Audrey, earlier this year in March, you wrote an op-ed piece, a very good op-ed piece, which appeared in the Star Tribune. It was titled, "Create Minnesota's Health Insurance Exchange the Right Way." And you actually warned about this, what you called market flooding. I think that's what you've been describing here, where there are so many choices it actually has the effect, not really of educating consumers, but kind of overwhelming them with too many choices. But you also were an advocate for what we call the active purchaser model. Tell us a little bit about that. What is the active purchaser model? And to tag on to that, did Minnesota get it right? Did the legislature create MNsure in a way that looks out for the best interests of Minnesota insurance consumers?
So, by the way, their title, not mine.
Yeah.
But my whole point was, and I of course was speaking for small businesses, that we need to set up a health insurance exchange, a health insurance marketplace that meets the needs of Minnesotans. And most people in Minnesota are either the small business owners or they're employed by small businesses. And we wanted to make sure that the oversight was going to be neutral, which in the beginning it was not, meaning that they had begun to craft the bill that the insurers would oversee MNsure, which made no sense to us. We wanted to make sure that small businesses had representation on the oversight board, which they didn't at first. And then the last thing we really wanted was that active purchaser. And as a compromise, they said, well, we're going to delay active purchaser for a year. Now, in real layman's terms, active purchaser means now that you have a pool, instead of 5 employees, we're all going to go on to MNsure. You'll have a pool of 1.3 million people, something like that. The risk is mitigated. When you have that many people and you spread the risk across all of them, you should be able to have that bargaining power that I was telling you that the really large businesses have. So if you have, I worked for a company that had over 100,000 employees. They could self-insure, they could spread that risk, they could keep their costs down. Us small business owners don't have that choice, but I tell you what, you put me in a pool with 1.3 million people, and we should be able...
Spreading the risk, and that's really at the core of the whole philosophy behind insurance, isn't it?
And
because you're going to have a mix. You're going to have a mix. Some people are going to get sick and require expensive care, but you're also going to have a lot of people who are hopefully healthy people.
Right, it's just like your homeowner's insurance.
Yeah.
Whether you think you pay too much or not, the point is everybody has homeowners insurance. That's a lot of homes to be insuring.
Right.
Most of them are going to be okay. Only some of them are going to put in claims. So anyways, the point that I was going to make is that that's where you get some of your bargaining power, where you can start negotiating, saying, come on, the risk is really mitigated here. Let's talk cost. And I don't think we're there yet. I think we will get there eventually.
As we know from watching the news, there have been a lot of stories in the news recently about the problems with accessing the online website for the Federal Exchange. We're not running into that as much here in Minnesota because, as we've been discussing, we have MNsure, the state-based exchange. But on the federal website, clearly they've had some problems. Are you surprised that they've had these technical problems with this site, and do you think they'll get them fixed?
Well, I'm not an IT professional, so I want to make that quite clear. But again, I worked with an IT, a CIO and a CTO, and we did plenty of rollouts, big rollouts. They were never perfect on day one. Yes, I think they'll be fixed. I can't really comment on, did it go as smooth as it should have or not. We would have all liked it to have been perfect, but they had millions, I think. They had far more many people accessing the site than they expected in the beginning. So if you're in, if you're in marketing, if you run a business, if you sell a product, everything's on a bell curve. You have your early adapters. Those are those 2 to 5% of the people that are standing in line to buy their Tickle Me Elmo or the iPhone. Those are the outliers where masses of people wanted to purchase something right away. That usually doesn't happen that way. So I think they were a little surprised how many people went not just to shop, but just to window shop. So they weren't
think
purchasing.
One of the big stories here that we might be missing, I know one of the narratives from Senator Cruz and some of the Tea Party cohort has been, nobody wants this. But in fact, the news stories seem to be validating something quite different, that the website has been overwhelmed by millions and millions of people trying to get information about insurance products and actually purchasing insurance products through the Federal Exchange.
Yep, absolutely.
But I suspect they're going to get this problem fixed. I was sharing a story with a friend recently who said to me, you think back to the 1920s, the early days of commercial aviation, airplanes weren't very safe. They crashed, sometimes pretty frequently. But did we stop building airplanes? Did we stop flying? No, we didn't. We built better, safer airplanes, and I suspect that that's probably what we're going to see, that these technical problems will get fixed.
And that's actually a great way of putting it. And of course they'll get fixed. I don't think there's ever been an IT problem that hasn't been fixed. But I would also like to remind people that you will have a small segment of people signing up in the very beginning. You'll have a bigger segment sign up as it goes on, and then you'll have what they call late adapters, those people who wait to the very last minute to sign up. I've talked to a lot of business owners that said, we are so busy right now. Again, they don't have people dedicated often to healthcare or the HR stuff, because there's 5 of them. So often that falls to the business owner. But my point is, they're waiting to the last minute because that's just human nature. A lot of people will wait to the last minute.
And this has been a concern, I know, this issue of so-called adverse selection, where there's been some concern that young, healthy people are not going to enroll and purchase health insurance, and you're going to be left with a disproportionate pool of people who are maybe older and sicker. But in fact, the experience, what you're talking about, is that in Massachusetts, for example, under Mitt Romney's plan, young people did enroll, but they were the last people to enroll before the Massachusetts mandate took effect.
From a marketing standpoint, that doesn't surprise me
Yeah.
at all.
So actually what you're saying is, we know from past experience in Massachusetts, that's how it rolled out, and that's how it worked.
And actually that's one of the beauties of having young people stay on parents' plans when they can till the age of 26. They're signed up because of that. So.
Yeah. There have also been some news stories that have pointed out that a number of Minnesotans are in fact seeing their policies being canceled by their insurance companies. But let's be clear, what are we talking about here? Minnesota actually has a law that guarantees renewability of health insurance plans, so as I understand it, technically nobody's really being canceled, but the policies are having to change to conform with the requirements of the Affordable Care Act, right?
Exactly.
The Affordable Care Act says no lifetime limits on coverage. It has some basic standards for insurance that have to be met by all of the plans. And in fact, aren't some of the insurance companies using this as an excuse to jack premiums up for people.
Well, I haven't heard about the increase in premiums because of that, but I definitely will say, you know, when a policy, and again, I'm not the expert on this, but when a policy has to be rewritten, obviously you're going to be issued a new policy or be asked to go decide what new policy you want. The lifetime maximums, as you know, is just vital. Health insurance cost, especially when there's been a severe illness or a horrible accident, it's the #1 reason for bankruptcy. And if you think, you know, if you consider that small businesses employ half the people in Minnesota, you have a business owner who has a lifetime max on his health insurance, and God forbid he gets very ill or he has an accident and he goes bankrupt, his employees lose their job. The whole business goes down. In a small business, the liability of that small business is on the shoulders of the business owner personally. So he has no, you know, big structure behind him to be the guarantor of his business.
And let's be real clear, these previous caps on coverage, lifetime caps on coverage, they were basically a tool so that insurance companies could drop somebody when they did have a catastrophic illness.
Yeah. I mean, that's what happened.
That is in effect.
They might disagree that's why they did it, but
and
that
in
is what
fact,
happened.
now they're not going to be able to do that in 2014 because of the Affordable Care Act.
A lot of this I haven't seen in the news too much either. They call it a poison pill. So you might get a plan that you think is pretty darn good, and then one day you get a certain illness, and well, guess what? You didn't read that 120-page document that says, by the way, we're not going to cover this one illness or these 2 or 3 illnesses. So those are all, you can't do that anymore. You know, all those are taken out, and again, and under MNsure, you get that apples to apples comparison. You know you have a good plan when you sign up.
Well, I know there's been a lot of apprehension and anger and opposition to the Affordable Care Act, but I think there's one number, we hear about a lot of numbers, but there's one number I think we should all be keeping in mind, the number 0. Because 0 is actually the number of people who are going to be insured under the alternative Republican plan. They don't have a plan to cover people if you repeal the Affordable Care Act. And we would go back to the days when insurance companies didn't have to insure kids for pre-existing conditions or adults. You could go back to lifetime limits on benefit payments. You could go back to dropping coverage for screenings for things like breast cancer and charging differential rates for medical services to men and women. All of those things are in the Affordable Care Act, and you would lose those if this law ended up being repealed.
You know, I think you make a good point. I sometimes wonder when the detractors, if you will, from this effort, I rarely hear the facts and figures to back up what they're saying. And even if there are facts and figures, that, you know, when it gets down to it, there are people who are dying because they don't have health insurance. There are businesses that are closing because the owner went bankrupt because of lack of health insurance. And you know, this is a civic duty. It's you know, we all do better when we all do better type of thing.
And we've seen, haven't we, Audrey, what happens when people don't have insurance? They go to the emergency room, which is the most expensive type of health care that we can possibly deliver.
And they also don't get their you know, your regular visits to the doctor to make sure your screenings and stuff. My sister's a physician. She's heartbroken the number of times she sees a patient in the emergency room. If they had just come to her in the beginning, when they started to have troubles, and she could have treated them, and then it's too late. They're in the emergency room because it's a crisis situation, which is, you know, it's hard on the taxpayer dollars, it's hard on the family's finances, but it's also devastating to the friends and families and the individual that is affected by that.
And you know, aside from that human dimension and the moral dimension, frankly, of allowing sick people to go untreated or undiagnosed, is this economic issue, that it costs all of us a lot more when we allow these medical conditions to deteriorate, because they end up being so much more expensive to treat, and the medical outcomes are much more speculative.
Absolutely.
Yeah. If you could make one change to the Affordable Care Act, I hope I'm not putting you on the spot here, if you could make one change to the new health care law, what would it be?
You know,
and why?
And I'm going to stay at the state level. So
okay,
of course,
so
of course I'm going to go back to the active purchaser There is no reason that I've been able to find or that anyone's been able to give me to say we are handing over new customers to insurers, and that's great. That's great for the insurers, but it's also great for the public who's going to get insured. But when you get that many new customers, and again, the risk is mitigated, you're now part of a big pool, we should be able to start doing some negotiating with the insurers just the way big businesses do the same negotiating when they buy insurance or they self-insure, either way. And so that, you know, I would obviously like to see that change. We wrote that in the op-ed, and we were down at the Capitol testifying on that. I'm still hopeful for that. I do think, though, Steve, I want to say, I do think this is a situation where it is going to take, you know, some months, maybe a year or two, for it to really get rolling and to get all the bugs ironed out and to get the costs down. You know, this isn't something that's going to happen overnight. It's a huge undertaking. And quite frankly, it's something we've let go for so long. We've created our own problem that we now need to correct.
And MNsure has this governing board where most of the membership, as I understand, or the membership is appointed by Governor Dayton, and it's actually a pretty diverse board. But there were a number of people who were saying, well, the MNsure governing board should actually have guaranteed seats, multiple seats, for representatives of the insurance companies. What is your view about that?
So that was the conflict of interest, is something else that we were a little concerned about. And the people who said, well, I think MNsure should be overseen by people who work in the insurance industry, you know, it's the old fox guarding the hen house. So Small Business Minnesota disagreed with that. We just thought it was an inherent conflict of interest. Even in a business situation, you would see that as a conflict of interest. But I will tell you, several members on the board no longer work in the insurance industry, but they used to. So they have the expertise. And
so it's not as if the insurance industry's concerns are not being brought to the board.
And the knowledge. And that was the folks who were saying we have to have the insurance industry in there. They were saying, well, what, you know, we need the expertise. Well, you can get the expertise without having someone being the oversight as well.
I'm fond of telling the story to people. I've said, well, you know, the Securities and Exchange Commission regulates the securities industry. That doesn't entitle Goldman Sachs to a seat on the SEC.
Yep.
And so when you're in a regulatory role, when actually the regulatory agency is in fact supposed to be looking out for the interests of Minnesotans, for consumers.
Absolutely.
Yeah. If you were to look into the crystal ball, we have less than a minute.
Okay.
Tell me, what does Minnesota healthcare look like in 20 years?
How many goodness,
people, what percentage of our population is going to be insured?
100%. I mean, other countries have done this. 20 years down the road, there should be no reason that every American, every Minnesotan shouldn't be insured. They should have coverage, yes.
Great. And I know there seems to be increasing interest in the Minnesota legislature on moving Minnesota toward universal coverage. So the federal debate's going to continue, and I suspect we're going to continue to see discussion here in Minnesota too. Audrey Britton, Public Relations Director for
Small Business Minnesota.
Small Business Minnesota. Thank you for being our guest today on Access to Democracy, and come back to see us again.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Yeah.